in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
So what's new, Jim? How are things? What's the latest?
Oh, living the dream there, Mike. Let's see. It's hurricane season where I am. So I finally, after 20 years of talking about it, got a generator for my house. Can't plug it into the house yet. I got to get an electrician to wire it and stuff, but that's been one of my projects lately too.
Apparently the West Coast has a hurricane season too now, I guess.
They've got they got fires, floods, mudslides, killer bees. They got it all. It's good.
And they had a hurricane. Hashtag we will rebuild or something.
And an earthquake on the day of the hurricane, because of course they did. It's good.
Sorry, California.
Mm-hmm. So, Mike, what have you been up to?
It's working, man, and raising my kid and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Trying to get my sleep in order. We're going to be bringing on a sleep expert soon.
That's good.
I need to make arrangements with them, but we sent some emails a week or two ago, and we're going to have him on to talk about sleep stuff, which I've already heard a lecture from him, and I'm just trying to figure out how to apply it to my reality, because my sleep schedule's kind of a shit show. But
nice. Oh, that's another thing I did recently. I took some leadership and human relations training, and I'm pretty cynical about that stuff. And this was a 2-day. It was run by the Arbinger Institute. We're starting to hear, at least in my world, we're starting to hear a little bit more about them. And they got a couple books. One is called Leadership and Self-Deception. So that's what I'm reading right now. It turns out really smart people are good at lying to themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And about why it's okay to be a dick to other people. Mm-hmm. And that we have to be talking about other people, right? Like that couldn't possibly be
obviously
me.
Not something that would describe either of us.
Obviously not me. I'm a pilot, so obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what's good for that? Therapy. Therapy's pretty good at teaching you how to stop lying to yourself. It's been my lesson.
I wouldn't know.
All the ways you're tricking yourself.
So my main therapy is actually doing this podcast, which is bullshit and is not therapy. But that is my kind of anti-drug, anti-crazy is getting into stuff and understanding it and trying to help our audience understand it. And tonight we picked a doozy. We picked a bad outcome. Mm-hmm. And we need to understand that bad outcome so we don't keep having bad outcomes. So let's get into it. Now, for our listeners, imagine you personally, whoever you are listening to this podcast right now, imagine you are dead asleep. It's like somewhere between midnight, 1 a.m. You just worked a long shift. Maybe you had an argument with your spouse or your employer, or it took a long time to get your kids to bed. Maybe you had a couple beers to unwind after a crappy day at work. I mean, who hasn't had a crappy day at work, right? Mm-hmm. And very abruptly, and you live in an apartment building, let's say, so you got neighbors and, there's always some drama happening in apartment buildings. That was my experience. And very abruptly, you hear a commotion, muffled shouting, right? Glass shattering.
Words.
Some asshole beating on and then kicking in your door. What do? Now, like any red-blooded American, you probably fumble around in the dark for your nightstand gun, your EDC, or your phone, or a baseball bat, or golf club, or vibrator, whatever it is you keep on your nightstand. You're going to grab something. You're probably not seeing real well. You don't probably, if you wear glasses, you probably don't have them on. Maybe you're wearing one of them little face masks to keep the, keep the wrinkles away, right? And you're going to go deal with whatever is going on, whatever rowdy neighbor or hostile intruder or whatever, ISIS is coming through your door, right? And then you get shot like 69 times because it turns out who was at your door was the cops. And you had something in your hand. Well, you effed around and you found out, didn't you? So that sucks. And let's not do that. Let's not have that scenario happen. And there's some learning I think that everybody maybe needs to have on that. That is not a reasonable outcome, but that has happened enough times in enough places. We need to understand it, and we need to understand it from both sides of the door. And we're going to address it tonight.
And both sides of the door is a big thing, because certainly there are times where the police are going to go break down someone's door and forcefully enter and search for stuff. That's part of the game, right? And that's fine, but we have to make sure that we are doing it in a way that is safe for everybody involved. And in this particular incident, it wasn't just the innocent person that got killed, right? It was also, even one of the officers got hurt. So it's a bad outcome all around, and that's why I think seeing the whole picture is important.
And this is one of them contentious ones. That's why we're stalling. This is a contentious one, and we got to be.
I think I disagree. I don't think it's contentious. Really, I think it's a bad outcome. There's nothing, like, in my mind, there's no controversy in there.
Well, here's what's contentious, right? Is I make a big point, because I am not a cop, of listening to our cop audience specifically and hearing what they say about instances where the cops are taking a lot of flack, right? And generally speaking, a lot of our cop buddies point out, hey, we want to give them every benefit of the doubt. I wasn't there. I can't judge. Mm-hmm. And that's cool. And I understand that. And I understand that, when an AC-130 gunship blows up a hospital in Afghanistan, I also try to give that crew every benefit of the doubt. So let's say even giving all the benefit of the doubt to everybody, but particularly the cops, things went sideways. Things went wrong. We need to understand that, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the controversy in this event had a lot to do with underlying narratives, right? And a lot of it came back to things like racism and the controversy of no-knock search warrants and things like that are all good arguments to have, but it doesn't change that the outcome in this case was fucked up, and that the officers in this case fucked up. It just doesn't change that. So Breonna Taylor was killed in March of 2020 by a group of officers doing a narcotics investigation. And this is just to like preface some of this with, like, for anyone who hasn't gotten the memo, like, we lost the war on drugs. We know that's not like really a thing, right?
We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of experiencing like the war on drugs 2.0 with the fentanyl stuff. But we have deprioritized that quite a bit in a lot of ways. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a place for it, or that we should not tackle that problem on some level, but we do need to consider the risk involved and if the juice is worth the squeeze, right? So March 2020, these guys doing a narcotics investigation in Louisville, Kentucky, serve a search warrant at an apartment belonging to Breonna Taylor. She was not a suspect, but someone that she was hanging out with was either a suspect or a person of interest, depending on how you want to read into it. so her boyfriend or alleged boyfriend was mostly kind of the person that they were after. The warrant that they were serving at her apartment alleged that that apartment might contain either drugs or proceeds from illicit activity involving that investigation, because she was coming and going with him to different places. We're not going to go too far into the validity of those claims and the investigation itself, because we're here to deal with the tactical considerations as far as the warrant service goes and the bad outcome. So as far as the warrant goes, that is why they were there. That's what they were more or less looking for. They had a search warrant. It was approved by a judge. And there is this important conversation to have about the integrity of their investigation, because a lot of people have talked about how, maybe they were falsifying some information, or they made some claims that were later found to be untrue, or they couldn't substantiate, and blah, blah, blah. And as far as this episode goes, let's just assume that everything was good with the investigation.
Let's give them every benefit of the doubt.
And that everything was absolutely warranted in this case, right? As far as getting the warrant and going there that night, right? So not the scope of the episode as far as the validity of that goes, but that is what they were there for, right? So as far as that goes, just consider that any time we serve a search warrant, if we're going to go involuntarily into someone else's house, there is risk involved, not only to the officers, but also to the public, to the suspects, to anyone that might be on the fringes of that, or bystander, whatever. So there has to be ways to manage and mitigate that risk. And as the old adage goes, with great power comes great responsibility.
And that's not just a cute saying. I mean, we really do put a lot of power into the hands of police officers. Just giving you the badge and the gun is putting you in every fight is a gunfight, because you're introducing a gun to those fights, right? You have the power to detain. You have the power to search and seize. Those are big things, right? And it's important to point out here that when we talk about, well, there was a search warrant. Yes, there was a search warrant, but a search warrant is not official sanction that what you are doing is smart or prudent or appropriate or ethical or tactically viable. Any of that. It's just legal sanction that you have provided the court enough justification that the dude or the evidence that you're looking for is going to be there, that you have established probable cause that you're going to find what you're looking for. That's it. The burden of due diligence doesn't rest with the court. It rests with you and your agency. Do you have the right guy? Is he actually guilty of something worth raiding? Do you have the right address? Who else is there? Are there dogs? Are there kids? Oh, and what if you're wrong? That's not the court's problem. Just having like a search warrant doesn't make all of that stuff go away. If anything, it makes all of that stuff that much more your problem.
Yeah, it's not a blank check, right? And to Jim's point, it's based on probable cause, which isn't the full story, right? You're giving sufficient data to make a decision about this one piece of a bigger puzzle. Can I go search this person, place, or thing for this thing, right? And these are the reasons I want to. It doesn't necessarily summarize, the 15, 20 minutes that it might take you to read off an affidavit to a judge or something might not capture every detail of a weeks or months long investigation. It's just a snapshot. It's just presenting it to an impartial third party to say, these are the reasons I want to do this. I'm asking for the legal permission to do it. And they say yes or no. The rest of that decision making comes on you. And the thing is like, yeah, can you be deceptive? Can you skirt the lines? Can you be in the gray? Can you be unsure about things? Yeah, but if they replay that affidavit in the aftermath of something like this and it turns out that you were full of it, that's not going to do you any favors, right? So it's in your best interest to get it right in the first place. But either way, it's still not a blank check. Either way, Breonna Taylor shouldn't have been killed. So you're still accountable for that if you're that guy, right? Like it doesn't excuse you from any wrongdoing. So, yes, it is important to be careful with our ability to investigate, to apply for search warrants in the first place, to detain and arrest people. And one of the things that I always emphasize to new police recruits when I teach them is, it wasn't that long ago that the people of this country decided to overthrow their government and like start their own thing. And you really have to keep that in perspective, because as law enforcement, we tend to be the most adversarial members of government that anyone interacts with, except for maybe like the DMV. that might be the one exception. But like
the IRS.
Yeah. But it is more important than ever to make sure that we are the balance between public safety and security and the liberty that our nation was stood up on, right? And you have to be careful with that, right? Like, give that the attention it deserves. So this event was one of several. Think of the time frame, March 2020. This is right before George Floyd, right after a bunch of other things. This was part of one of many coals in the fire of civil unrest that we experienced for a period of time in 2020. And the thing about riots and civil unrest is they are often more emotional than rational, right? People are pissed off and all of that. But you have to understand that that is at least a symptom or a suggestion of something that we might have to correct course on, something that the pendulum might have to swing one way or the other on, right? So take that for what it's worth, but understand that even though it's emotional, when people start rioting and protesting and get all uppity about stuff, there might be more to that story that we need to correct course on, and it's important that we give that the attention it deserves. So back to the incident, moving on. So they're at this apartment. They're going to serve this search warrant. They applied for a no-knock warrant, which excuses the police from the requirement to knock on the door and give someone time to answer and let them in voluntarily, right? It's important to note in this event specifically that although they applied and were granted a no-knock exception, they did not use it. They still claimed that they knocked and announced. Now we'll come back to that in a minute because there's an important point there. There's actually several, so we'll come back to the no-knock thing. The other part of it was they were also serving this warrant at night. Jim mentioned between midnight and 1 a.m., and this is also something that typically you need to have some justification and permission from a judge to serve outside of normal hours, right? A nighttime exception is also a thing that you have to ask and apply for with its own justification. And I'm not sure what the nighttime exception in this case was. That's one thing that I was not able to find much detail on. So serving a search warrant at this place at night, and at the point that they forced the door open, there was a single gunshot from inside. It struck one of the officers in the leg. 3 officers returned fire into the apartment. They struck and killed Breonna Taylor. She was 26 years old. Her boyfriend, the guy that was in the apartment with her, there's some, I guess, discussion about whether that was her boyfriend or not. But the guy,
male occupant of the apartment who she was socially involved with.
Yeah,
right.
The guy in the apartment who was with her. Initially, he actually said that she fired the shot, but then later admitted that he did, and that he fired the shot as a warning to whoever was coming in the door. There was also a 911 call that was placed at one point. He called 911, and that seems to be validated. Now, whether the timing of that might be up for discussion, but there was a 911 call that was received from him, and he claimed that he did not know it was the police. One of the wilder parts of this story is that one of the officers from the area of the front door went I guess around a corner or something, and fired 10 rounds through a closed sliding glass door with a curtain that he could not see past. That's fucking wild. There is no excuse for that. His rounds were not the ones supposedly that one of the other officers was, I guess, credited with the shot that killed Breonna Taylor. It was not one of his rounds, but several of his rounds did go into an adjoining apartment that was also occupied by a kid, among others. A total of 32 rounds were fired by 3 officers, and obviously we know the outcome here. Breonna Taylor was killed. The guy was arrested. again, outside of the scope of really what we want to get into here as far as how the rest of the investigation went. But that is how Breonna Taylor was killed, and that's what I want to focus on.
Yeah, a couple of key points to hit in that synopsis. So initially, the police go to the door. They do some variation of knocking and announcing, and it's disputed how much knocking and announcing happened. Some people heard it, some people didn't. But that is one of the issues, right? Then they decided to ram the door, use a conventional battering ram, hit the door. Took about 3 big, sturdy tries to hit the door. I don't know, because I don't breach doors, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but
3
it
hits,
left on an apartment door.
Depends on the door.
Okay. Entry guy.
One's the goal, obviously.
I would have thought, but I don't know. I don't kick down doors, right? Entry guy stops in the entryway. What one might call a fatal funnel. There's a reason it's called that. Don't be there, right? Kenneth, the male occupant of the apartment who was not the subject of the investigation, he was just a guy who was there, has his gun and shoots his quote-unquote warning shot, hits the entry guy in the leg, femoral artery. So it's kind of a big deal, right? Getting hit in one of your big timers. Entry guy takes that 1 round and he returns fire 4 to 6 times, missing the male all 6 times. He assumes he's been hit in the femoral artery, goes down, starts kind of trying to pull himself out of the apartment. One fellow officer steps on his leg to try to put pressure on it, and another one tries to use his belt as a tourniquet, which seems odd in this day and age that we're using belts as tourniquets.
2020, guys. 2020.
Okay. They call for an ambulance on the radio. They're screaming on the radio. You can actually hear some of the transmissions. We don't have any video of it because we'll get to that. They call in for the ambulance. The ambulance comes to the wrong gate at the apartment and gets kind of stuck at like a fire gate. And they're screaming like, ram it, ram it. So the ambulance rams it and gets stuck in the gate. The officers at that entryway decide they're going to throw their hurt fellow officer onto a police car and drive him on the hood of the car to the entangled ambulance. But that's all going to happen in the next minute or two. It's at this point during the screaming that the officers called for SWAT. Okay. And at about this time, and Mike mentioned this earlier, officer, we'll call him Brett, decides to flank the apartment, goes around to the side and sees that window. There's vertical blinds blocking his view. He shoots blindly through that window, through Breonna's apartment and in the direction of a pregnant neighbor and her 5-year-old kid. Fortunately, missing them at least. The male, at some point, the male occupant, Kenneth, calls 911 and says, someone kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend. And this is the first time law enforcement learns there's a woman at the scene and that she's wounded. And I'm curious how long it took that message to get from the operator to the officers. But when I was going through this case and I was going through the documents on it, I was struck at how similar that sounded to other cases we've heard. A case where a law enforcement agency shot blindly through a window and killed a female that they didn't know they were shooting. That sounded like Ruby Ridge to me. And it isn't, I'm not saying it's the same. I'm saying that rhymes, right? So something to consider. At some point, our survivor in the apartment surrenders, and then the SWAT team made entry, clears the place, sees all the bullet holes, and eventually finds Breonna deceased. That's a rough night. That's a rough night for everybody. One little synopsis thing is one of the things that actually did get recorded when they arrested Kenneth, the male occupant. You can hear them explain to Kenneth he's going to jail for the rest of his life. Well, first off, be careful what you say on the tapes because that didn't play well. And second, he did not go to jail. In fact, his case was dismissed with prejudice. And what that means, and I'm not a lawyer, but big picture, what that means is the court said, we're not hearing this case and don't even try to bring this case back. This case insults the court. And that's important when we're talking about our legal authority and our warrant, which covers our actions. If your case insults the court, that says something about your public credibility, right? So, rough night.
Yeah, one thing I want to hit on is the timing of when they called SWAT, because calling a tactical team is not something you really can do as an afterthought, right? Like there's a whole, it's a machine and there's a startup process. There's a lot that goes into that whole thing. And
got to put down your hair dryer, got to put on all your gear. I understand. It's very important. Yeah.
And although like we do hasty things, like you can respond to the active killer, the hostage thing kind of in a hurry, hastily after the fact, after it started, certain problems can't be solved with that kind of timeline, right? And so it's not really the sort of thing you should call after the fact. Now, the question becomes, should they have used SWAT in the first place? And this is actually, talk about like points of contention. One of the things that's come up in my neck of the woods over the last, 10 years or so since I've been on the team is, why do we need to use a SWAT team to serve every search warrant? Like, just because it's narcotics related, what makes it high risk? Like, what is the, and so there's like a threat or risk matrix or like assessment that we have to do now. And the point is, showing up with the SWAT team, like a bunch of dudes wearing helmets and body armor, flashbangs and machine guns, like that is a level of force, like a show of force in and of itself that rises the justification level a little bit, right? And so
it's also clearly marked. There's no question at all whether the SWAT team is the cops, right?
Well, sure. Yeah. And they're not wearing plain clothes or anything like that. That helps. But my point is, this is one of those be careful what you wish for kind of scenarios, because some people have said like, use the SWAT team less to do this sort of thing. There's no reason we have to call them in. And the thing is like, you're dismissing a lot of expertise, training, institutional knowledge, and a lot of other things that we can bring to the table that, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying we should go out and do every search warrant ever, but you get something with it, right? And sometimes that level of escalation, just showing up and letting the experts handle it and making clear to anyone in that apartment, like the no effing around crew is outside. It's time to just cooperate. Sometimes that can lead to a more peaceful outcome to begin with, right? So while we're not here to trash people for sport, this whole thing was fucked up, right? We've said that a number of times at this point. And there's a lot of narrative out there about all the conspiracies and like the racism that's involved and like cover-ups about this whole thing. And we mentioned the discussion about the integrity or the worthiness of the investigation to begin with, as well as the investigation into the officers after the shooting. And my point in all of that, and the reason that we're not going to dive into that here, is who cares? It still doesn't change anything here. So I just want to make sure that we're clear about the parts of this that were absolutely reckless, right? And absolutely unacceptable. Firing blindly into an apartment at something you cannot see is never okay. Never okay. I don't care if you're getting shot at. I don't care if your buddy gets hurt, right? We're supposed to be the good guys. We have to be better than that.
And even with that being true, even with having a buddy get hurt, your return fire is ineffective, right? So not only are you throwing a lot of danger into the atmosphere when you throw a bunch of bullets into the atmosphere, you're also not stopping the threat, right? So again, even if we give every benefit of the doubt to the officers, it was still a clear error.
Yeah. This young lady should not have been killed. There's no There's really no dispute, no contention, no controversy over that. That's clear. And I would point out that as far as the narrative about racism goes, hard to know she was a black woman if you can't see into the apartment through the covered curtain. Like, it doesn't sell well to begin with, right? So I've heard a whole bunch of stuff from people generally supportive of the police about, like, she was hanging around with the wrong people or making bad life choices. None of that matters. None of it excuses the misconduct of the officers. So I just want to make sure that we're super clear about that point. One, this was fucked up. And two, that shooting blind is never acceptable. Period. End of story. That's all there is to it.
Yeah. It's also worth considering that this was not one error by one officer in the heat of the moment. We can point out specific errors individual officers made, but more importantly, this was a chain of events, right? And even, again, if we give all the benefit of the doubt and assume best intentions, we still have to call this baby ugly, which is why we keep pointing that out, right?
Yeah. And I know it's like a broken record status, but like for real.
But it's important. We got a point to make there, right? And there are lessons to be learned here, which is why we're doing this episode, right? We aren't in the business of trash talking, second guessing, but we are absolutely in the business of understanding error chains. And we want to teach you how to recognize and break those error chains, and that's what we're doing. So that's a lot of preamble to understand. We got to put our feelings about the case and how the media handled it and all that aside and understand the error chains.
So where does that lead us in terms of practical considerations for lessons learned from the Breonna Taylor incident? The first big one that I can think of is, how do we manage or mitigate risk for search warrants? Serving a search warrant, I said this earlier, if you are going to force your way into somebody's house against their will to search the place, like, in and of itself, that is always going to be a risky endeavor. And you cannot eliminate every risk. You can manage and mitigate risk. You can't always eliminate it, right? So the first thing is talking about no-knocks. Now, I mentioned that in this case, they applied for and were granted a no-knock. I'm curious what the justification was for that or why they applied for it, but because it's not just a blanket thing. You have to ask specifically for that. But they didn't use it, right? They still claim that they knocked and announced, and that's fine. But what it really boils down to is, what is the purpose of a no-knock, right? They have their time and place. A couple examples I can think of, because a lot of people want to just ban them outright. And in fact, the city council of Louisville banned the police from using no-knock warrants after this event. And in their case, rightfully so, right? Like they kind of fucked up for themselves.
Real quick, there's a strategic corporal aspect here, right? Where a tactical decision made by one group of cops across the country is going to affect your ability all the way across the country to get a no-knock warrant now because of how bad this one went.
Yeah.
And several others, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple things. First, like we said, in this instance, they applied for the no-knock and then did some variation of a knock and announce. So they asked for and got the no-knock, which is why we keep talking about it. But then they shifted to something in between. And everyone agrees that there was some level of knocking and some level of announcing. What they disagree about is how loud and how clear that was. And so I describe this as kind of like boxer briefs. They try to have their cake and eat it too, right? And I've seen instances like this where the cops they're going to do a knock and announce, but they're going to do it kind of quiet or really, really quick, like knock, announce, bang, right?
Here, by the way, on the boxer briefs thing.
Yeah. No, you can't. This isn't Burger King. You can't have it your way. So, so my suggestion is be intellectually consistent. Either do the no knock all the way, or do a full conventional knock, announce kind of thing. Right. If the reason for the no knock is threat level, then I think, personal opinion, Jim's opinion, it's probably dangerous enough to use the SWAT team.
Yeah, I don't know why a plainclothes unit would ever be doing a no-knock.
Yeah. And if the point was destruction of evidence, that's a different story. But if there's so much drugs that they're selling and distributing, that's a lot of flushing that they're going to do. And if it's cash, I'd like to see how they flush that cash, but maybe Mike knows something about that. I don't know. Okay. Next point. If the point was surprise to not give the occupants time to arm up, that failed. The occupants in this case did arm up, at least one of them did. Okay. So this tactic failed. The half-assing it failed. Now, I understand there's lots of good reasons you want surprise, but consider what that surprise costs you in real life, right? And this is one of tactical fantasies. We'll surprise them. That's cool. But if you assume,
turns out you're not a Navy SEAL though, so
so you actually have to achieve that surprise, right? Now, if you assume the person on the other side of the door is an a-hole and is trying to kill you, that surprise is probably worth the cost, right? If you assume the person on the other side of the door is a normal, reasonable, sleeping person who you are now jolting into violent consciousness, how exactly do you think they'll react? I mean, you're a human being. How would you react?
Yeah, what's normal?
And we hear about like empathy. Like, this is a good empathy thing. If someone kicks down your door, what are you going to do? Right? Why do you expect them to act any different? Okay. And another thing that reminded me of like the Ruby Ridge scenario, if you go back, listen to our episode about that, everybody in this case who was shooting was more or less shooting in quote unquote self-defense, right? Everybody perceived a threat and they were all right. Everybody thought they were being ambushed. The problem was creating a situation that made them all feel like that, right? When you put yourself in danger, you're going to fear for your life, right? So don't do that. Okay. The plainclothes thing, it concerns me. This is kind of a recurring gym theme is I'm seeing a trend across law enforcement across the country toward less uniforms and less distinguishing markings on police cars. And I gotta say, I don't get it. I don't get it.
This is a good one for Jim.
Yeah, I do get it, and I'm really cynical about it. So, and I bring that up now because I want to bring up risk management, right? When we talk about officer safety, there are a lot of different risk control measures at our disposal to ensure officer safety. And officer safety is important. I get it. Okay. But when you select some risk control measure, you have to assess the costs of that measure. Is your risk control measure just shifting risk from the officer to the public? If so, that's a betrayal of the public's trust and the whole reason we have cops, right? And when those measures are employed, they usually work out just fine, it turns out, even the bad ones, because most officers are competent, decent human beings, and most bad guys are bad guys, and it just kind of works out. And most community members are reasonable until they're not. And over the course of thousands or millions of police interactions across the country each day, week, and year, those risks we are shifting onto the community members stack up. Okay, so no-knock warrants, plain clothes, unmarked cars, all those things that are justified with officer safety, we might need to question our assumptions about that. And I'm not saying never do it. It's not a black or white thing. Maybe the police car should be black and white, though. But it is one of the things that, by the way, is also causing a lot of the friction between law enforcement and the black community, right? And in a lot of cases, it's bad tactics and bad risk management, all justified under officer safety. So I challenge you, question the decisions you're making under the guise of officer safety.
And this is where I say we really have to try to outsmart some of this where we can. As a guy who has participated in a number of operations involving no-knocks, nighttime exceptions, plainclothes, and unmarked cars, I can tell you that they serve their place for sure.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I'm a huge advocate of all of those things. But just to hit some of these points, like the destruction of evidence bit, right? Flushing drugs. Well, just make sure that you get enough on your undercover deals or whatever that you've already reached the threshold that you have a good case. And now all you're there to do is arrest anybody, and anything else that comes after that's gravy, right? Like, your case should be good enough that it doesn't depend on what you might find. It should depend on what you already have, right? Destroying documents, that can be a big deal, right? So what can I do about that? Well, maybe I arrest him when he's not home and then go serve the search warrant. One of the big ones is like deleting data. Like if someone can like nuke their phone, or in the case of things like child porn, right? They usually have a mechanism in place to like destroy hard drives and stuff like that. And there's something to be said about making sure that we can get good cases on that, because sometimes some of those cases start with like an IP address and that's it, right? Like they don't have a lot of information until we serve that warrant. But there's a juice versus squeeze thing there, right? Like if I'm investigating a child porn thing where like some kid might be getting victimized, maybe I'm willing to accept a little bit more risk in that scenario. The case about officer safety, or just safety in general, like I have experienced this, right? Like if you're really good, right, you might be able to get in the front door with enough surprise and enough initiative that the guy or the gal inside doesn't have a chance to react, right? Or they feel like they don't have a chance to put up a fight, and it just compels their compliance. I've experienced that. There is something to be said there. Something about being up on like the second floor of an apartment building, like a landing, you have to go up the stairs where the door is, and you're going to be completely exposed up there while you knock on the door. There's something to be said about just popping that door open, and now I can see the living room and the hallway, and it gives me a little bit more standoff distance, right? If we assume they're in their bedrooms or something like that. There are cases where we might accept a little bit more risk ourselves to reduce the exposure to the public. And that second story apartment building is a good one. Like usually all the other apartments in that complex are going to be occupied. And so we want to limit that exposure to like the landing and the front door of that apartment. That could be a reason you might employ something like this. But I want to make sure that we're clear in that no matter what, anytime we do this, there is substantial risk involved, and you have to manage and mitigate that. And the one big thing here about no-knocks that I think is largely misunderstood is that a search warrant requires you to knock on the door and give the person an opportunity to come and answer it and let you in peacefully. A no-knock lets you open the door sooner than that. It doesn't mean you don't identify yourself, right? It doesn't mean that there's not some warning. And to Jim's point about like making it very, very clear that the cops are outside when that door comes open, that responsibility falls on you, right? The no-knock's been granted, right? But right before we're going to start knocking, maybe I want the police cars out front to turn on their red and blue lights. So what they see coming through the windows are those lights. Maybe I make a couple of announcements as I'm breaking the door or right before I break the door. I'm not giving them a chance to come and open it, but I've made sure that it's super clear to everybody. And by the way, it's 2023 now, right? Like we're talking about the age of cameras. I don't want to make it clear to just the people in that apartment that the police are outside. I want the world to know that the police are outside, right? Like loud, compelling, convincing, clear commands that the police are at this apartment number serving a search warrant. There's no mistaking that. So just because I get the permission to serve a quote unquote no knock, understand what that means, right? It's about letting them come to the door. It doesn't excuse you from your responsibility to announce and identify yourself on some level.
Agreed. I like that nuance, right? We're not saying don't do it. We're saying do it smart, right? consider in the juice versus squeeze, is preventing the destruction of evidence worth killing someone for? Okay? Because the risk you're trading here is violence, that you're willing to see some violence happen over that. Is the amount of dope that you can flush in that amount of time worth the drama? I think that's a valid question here. If there was anything on the site, it was probably cash. And like I said, I'm not sure what they thought was going to happen to that cash in 20, 30 seconds it was going to take to open the door. In the case of the announcements, I would offer, consider the burden is on you to make it clear that you're the cops. Are you sure? Are you 100% sure the occupants can hear you and understand you? Is there a language barrier? Do they have their hearing aids out? Do they have developmental delays? Are they drunk? Is it muffled by insulation? Do they have the TV on? Do they have a white noise generator? Do they sleep with earplugs in? If you're going to kill them for messing it up, then absolutely you have that burden to make sure that there's no question you're the cops.
Yeah, and this is so. In this event specifically, in some of the articles and stuff that I read about it, the media interviewed various neighbors and they reported different things. And I read that with like a grain of salt, right?
That's eyewitnesses. Eyewitness, right? They see whatever they see.
Sure. Eyewitnesses to begin with can be unreliable as a source from the get-go. But also, if you're in a part of town that isn't particularly friendly to the cops, which I've experienced, like, of course they're going to be like, no, I didn't hear shit. So I take it with a grain of salt. However, consider, like, if you make it clear to the world that, like, the cops are outside, not just people yelling, like with like a PA system that is like, yeah, I'm going to wake everybody up, but there will be no mistaking that it's the cops. Someone out there is going to be like, oh, I heard it clear as day, right? And even if they don't, the cameras, the recordings will make that super clear. On every search warrant that I've ever done, when we start making PA announcements, someone on the other side of the house outside, like on containment, will make sure that they check that box and be like, hey, your announcements are loud and clear on the back of the house. Like, way over here, I can hear them perfectly fine. And there's been times where we're like, hey, you need to turn the volume up. I can't, it's not as clear as it could be, right?
And, from an empathy standpoint, consider the OODA loop, right? The observe, orient, decide, act construct from Boyd. Think about how someone who's not you is going to observe those announcements, interpret them, and what decisions are available to them, what courses of action are available to them, right? Are they going to assume that you're a drunk neighbor or a pissed off ex-boyfriend, which was very viable in this scenario?
Yeah, or some other drug dealer that was, you know what I mean?
Yeah, a home invasion robbery crew who's there to get your dope.
Yeah,
who,
outright.
By the way, often dresses up in jeans and black tactical vests. You need to put yourself in their shoes a little and understand that those community members, the good guys and the bad guys, they don't think like you. And they don't know what you know about your tactics. They don't know you're the good guys. And that might be super obvious to you, but understand, even if they know you're the cops, they don't necessarily think you're the good guys. Okay?
Yeah, so some alternatives here in terms of like the no-knock, just blowing the door open and going in there. Which, by the way, that second-story apartment landing example that I used, I really like the application of explosives for that one. Sneak up there, put the explosive charge on the door, back away, then give them a chance to come out peacefully. And if they don't, you can open the door. But some other alternatives in terms of search warrants, obviously the classic is like contain and call out. Contain the house, surround the house, and call people out to you. The key in that is making sure that your case is compelling enough that it doesn't depend on any more evidence. Because you might not get any, right? It gives them time to potentially destroy evidence and all of that. But if your case is so airtight, then that shouldn't be a problem, right? You can let your surveillance and your intelligence do the work for you and just be patient and wait until you know the house is empty or very, very likely to be empty. Like if your main people that you're looking for, if you've seen them leave and now it's an empty house, then go serve it, right? And if you know who the people are, or if you're going to find out once you serve the thing, you could get them later. In a lot of cases, that's fine, right? There are cases where they might be a danger to the public or a danger to somebody else, and we don't want to let that happen. But often, building the case might be the best next step forward before you arrest them. And I know everyone wants to arrest them at the same time, and sometimes that's just, again, convenient. But if you need the evidence, then be patient. You could still get them, right? You could still get them later. And this is where, if you do that good surveillance and intel work, maybe when they're away from home, you can arrest them on a traffic stop, at their workplace, any number of ways where a lot of the risks associated with that search warrant are nullified, right? So those are just some alternatives. And without going into like all the tactics on how to achieve those things, I just want you to consider that, like, if you're thinking about, we need to do this a no knock at night, weigh out some alternatives and try to outsmart that a little bit. Don't ever let the justification be that you were impatient. And I get that, like, sometimes waiting sucks and sometimes you need to bring things to a close. That's, I agree, right? But you need to be very careful with that. It's a slippery slope.
And a corollary on this, one of the ways I've seen people justify bad decisions, in addition to officer safety, is, well, scarce resources. We don't have enough guys. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough time to dedicate to that. So we're just going to hit it. Okay. Resources are scarce. Well, no shit. Resources are scarce everywhere. Times are tough all over. Okay. If they are too scarce to do competent intelligence gathering and competent due diligence, they are too scarce to do raids. Do something else. Okay. That's that great power, great responsibility thing, right? If you're going to kick in doors, you need to have a very good sense of what's on the other side of that door. And there have been a number of instances where well-meaning police officers kicked in a door and didn't know what was on the other side, but should have known that there was a baby inside, for example, that they flashbanged. Bad outcome, right? So don't do that. And speaking of screwing up, consider, like, what's a reasonable expectation of the public's tolerance for screwing this up? How many of these do we get wrong? Across the country or across a region or across a city? How many times can we produce bad outcomes before the public should reasonably have some outcry over it? Once, twice, once a year, once every 3 years? I think that's something to consider when we talk about risk and probability. Like, how many times can you get it wrong? How many $100 million lawsuits can your agency support?
How many dead 26-year-olds?
How many dead 26-year-olds
or anything wrong?
Or dead 6-year-olds? Yeah. Right? So those are not Nerf bullets. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize is like, no, really, the due diligence is on you. And consider that if your tactics require perfect comprehension, cognition, and execution on the part of the other guy, the subject, or you're going to kill them, you're not being realistic. And in fact, you're the one being hazardous. You're the one fucking around at that point. Okay. So consider when you're developing tactics, what can I do in my tactics to make sure that even if someone is having a bad day, even if someone is having a mental breakdown, even if someone is drunk, even if someone is terrified, that I still get a good outcome from it. And if I'm in a fair fight with that, I didn't plan it properly.
Yeah, and there's going to come a point where you present your person of interest or your suspect or whatever with a choice. And I can tell you a number of times that I've used my dog on high risk arrests and the person runs and I send the dog after him and I'm like, hey man, why'd you run? Like, did you think you were going to outrun my dog? And they're like, I was scared. And people are like, oh, bullshit. Like, I hear this all the time. Like, oh, okay, you were scared. Sure. Think about it though. Like, this is a fight or flight thing, right?
They're in prey response.
They're not thinking clearly. They're in survival mode. And we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but like, I believe them when they tell me that. Like, they didn't perceive, they reacted, right? It was a response. And so we're going to present people with choices from time to time. They're going to either comply or not. They're going to pull a gun or they're not, right? But I want to make sure that like if there are elements of that I can pick and choose, then I want to pick and choose them. Right? I want to make sure when I have the option, and I don't always, but when I can, I want to choose the backdrop. I want to choose how heavily populated that area is. I want to choose the direction that I'm going to be shooting if I do, or the direction he's going to run if he's going to run. Like, consider those things, right? You build your tactics around that because you can't control what they're going to do. You can only control what you're going to do, right? They're going to get a choice. They can choose to surrender or not, but you need to plan for both.
I like that. You're responsible for the bullets that come out of your gun. And you're responsible for where they go. Yep. So I have noticed a couple of cycles about how the media covers this stuff and about how law enforcement agencies respond to this stuff. In an effort to demilitarize the police and make the police nicer. And I get it. Like there are too many people dying who don't need to die. I mean, that's a valid critique, right? The cycle that I see that troubles me the most is the bad training cycle, where bad training gets you bad tactical employment, gets you officers in danger, gets you I feared for my life, gets you shootings that you should and could avoid. Okay. My shorthand for that is a scared cop is a dangerous cop. And there's valid discussions to have about how true that statement is, but understand that all lethal force encounters, all self-defense encounters start with, I was afraid for my life, so I responded with potentially lethal force, right? So if you're putting yourself in positions where someone can put you in danger, then you're contributing to that. You are making choices, not just the other guy is making the choice, okay? There's also a related political stigma against quote unquote tactical training. Again, we want to make cops nicer. We want them to go through conflict resolution training. Maybe we should bring the Arbinger Institute in to teach them how they're telling lies to themselves to act like dicks, right? And that if you teach guys too much like fighting, you're going to get more fighting. Well, Mike and I, like our experience is the exact opposite. The more you have operators who really understand fighting, the less they feel like they have to fight. They understand what all of their options are and all their tools are. And we need to get better at explaining that. That's one of the things we try to do in this podcast.
There's an interesting story in this for me, like personally, just because it came at a time when I was brand new on SWAT and I had an opportunity to interact with a high-level Army shooter type. And we were talking about like building clearing, close quarters combat type scenarios and stuff. And he was talking about how like, oh, dude, it's way too dangerous. If it's not like hostage rescue, like I don't want to go in there. I want to surround the place and have them come out to me. And we're talking about legitimately one of the best trained shooters in the world. And like representing a group of the best trained shooters in the world. And these guys were telling, young SWAT cop Mike, like doing these dynamic entries on no-knock warrants in the middle of the night is sketchy as fuck. And that was an important point in my like professional development, is to hear them talk in those terms, because even they are saying, yeah, it's not usually worth it. Like I'd rather just, now their environment's a little bit different, right? they're not necessarily making an arrest, and they have the option of just dropping a bomb.
Well, yeah, but we have a quote we stole from Inglourious Bastards. The problem with fighting in a basement is you're fighting in a fucking basement, right? The problem with fighting in someone else's house is you're fighting in someone else's house.
Yeah. And so
maneuver warfare demands that you choose the time and place of the fight, right? Yeah. You don't let the other guy dictate it.
Yeah, but it's just in terms of what more training gets you. Quite frankly, like these guys are some of those violent people in the world, and they're telling me that, like, yeah, we don't even go into houses like that anymore, unless we absolutely have to. So it's just food for thought in terms of what good training, good tactics, and good experience gets you, right? And over time, we obviously learned that, and evolved accordingly as well. But it came at a very formative time for me, and I just thought it was an interesting little anecdote. But in terms of like round accountability and training stuff, your proficiency goes a long way, because your decision making and the cognitive performance that you have when it comes to making decisions in situations like this is going to be degraded. We have to accept that as a given. It's going to be degraded. So at the point that people are going to start pulling guns and start shooting and pulling the trigger, we want their proficiency to be so good that it eliminates or mitigates risk by itself, right? Because they're going to shoot what they're intending to shoot. So that's a big point on that. As it relates to reacting to gunfire, one of the things that we have to understand about training cops what to do when they get shot at is that conscious and rational decision-making and the thoughts associated with that are thwarted by survival-oriented behaviors. That fight or flight response, sympathetic nervous response, is going to interfere with conscious and rational thought. So reacting to contact is an inherently emotional, subconscious thing. If you take fire through a door, it's going to require a substantial amount of training and good imprinting to build a response to that, or like a script that you can rely on that's good, right? That's effective. And there's been a number of studies about police officers who were in lethal force encounters, and most of the stuff that came out of it was about perceptual distortions, right? They said things that, like, they don't remember hearing their gunshots, like they know they were firing, but it sounded like muffled pops. It wasn't like what they experienced at the range if they forgot to put in hearing protection. And it was like, and so we call that auditory exclusion. Things like tunnel vision, visual clarity, time and memory distortions. Those are all things that people in lethal force encounters have experienced, and those are well documented. And one of the things in one of the studies that I read said that 74% of the people that they surveyed said that they experienced part of the event on autopilot. They said things like, I don't even remember taking my gun out of my holster. I don't remember doing that reload. I don't remember fixing that malfunction in my gun. There were parts of the event that they don't remember doing, and that they felt like they just did it on autopilot. And that's significant, right? It speaks to the training that they had that imprinted those behaviors, reloads, malfunction clearances, things like that. So we have to build on that, capitalize on that, right? More training gets us there, gets us those good scripts, those good habits. And one of the big challenges in law enforcement is making sure that we do enough reps in training to offset the ones that we do in real life. Because in real life, often what we end up doing is reinforcing bad habits. And sometimes we don't even realize that, because the outcomes are usually good. Usually the outcomes are fine, right? Either because the person chose not to pull a gun or chose not to fight, or because we got lucky, and luck isn't a tactic, right? So we get away with making mistakes a lot of times in real life, and that's why that training is a big deal. And most of us don't have, even on a SWAT team, we don't really have the training time to do that really well, right? And I just want listeners to consider how much time a professional sports team spends at practice or in training versus in competition. And in law enforcement, that's reversed. So in terms of practical things, you want to prevent bad outcomes like this, I would offer that is something we need to correct course on. And that's a a societal thing. It's an institutional thing, right? Big picture takeaway.
So one of the things Mike brought up was reacting to contact, right? And a recurring theme, I've seen it many times, both in a military context and even a law enforcement context, is the concept of sympathetic or contagious gunfire, right? And there's this classic scene in the movie Predator where a guy is shooting his machine gun into the jungle blindly and screaming, and then like his bros also shoot into the jungle blindly screaming. And like, that's friendship. That's good. But you can't do that actually in law enforcement because we've got this thing called the Constitution. The Constitution says you can't.
Can I just say one thing? Like,
I'm just trying to make a fundamental ethical point, but yes, go ahead.
The same guy that I was talking to about like containing a place and doing a call out, we also talked about automatic gunfire. And he literally told me, because this is like the professional development thing, I'm like, when would you ever shoot in full auto versus semi-auto? And, you know, and again, this was young Mike talking here. And he goes, the only time I'm using full auto is if I get ambushed in a jungle. So it's funny you bring that
against
up.
the Predator. Yeah, I understand. So, but here's the thing in law enforcement is we've got this thing called the Constitution. The Constitution says you don't get to deprive people of life, liberty, property without due process of law. And specifically, like, every individual police officer is making in their own individual decision to use force, right? We don't sympathetically all use force. What he's saying there, sympathetically use force, is I shot because they shot. Yeah. And, you know, sound travels weird. And I get that sometimes you hear gunfire and you think it's the other guy, but it's really the guy next to you because of auditory exclusion and the way sound reverberates through rooms. I got it. Right. But that's where discipline comes in, and you have to make your own decision based on what you're seeing. Okay.
Another little tiny thing on that. This is a thing I've nerded out on just a little bit, is humans detect threats mostly with our eyes, right? And it's different than like dogs, right? And because I get asked a lot of like dog related questions, because how well can they see at night when they don't have flashlights and white light? We depend on white light. We tend to look for things more visually, right? We're not very auditory. Like, think about the shape of our ears and the size of our ears compared to most animals, right? That is not, from just an evolutionary standpoint, where we have learned to detect threats. It happens more up here in our eyes. So like, that's a key part of like processing in terms of training and decision making. I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. And that's what I'm telling you, is use your eyeballs, right? Yeah. Speaking of eyeballs, Officer Brett, the guy who flanked the apartment and shot through the window, one of the most concerning things he said at some point in one of his statements, he said he was shooting at muzzle flashes. Okay, so first off, Kenneth, the male occupant of the apartment, shot one round. And at that point, Officer Brett was somewhere by the entryway of the apartment, right? And so that's actually maybe the most concerning thing, because at the point he was shooting, the only muzzle flashes he could have seen were the muzzle flashes coming from his own team, from the entry team.
Yep.
Oops. Okay. So there's some shooting through barriers, right? And there's the barrier that is the window. There's the visual barrier that was the vertical blinds. Mike, what should I know about shooting through barriers?
There's a lot to be. This is an episode all by itself, but the bottom line is that anytime you send, what's the old, there's Isaac Newton had three laws, right? 3 rules. And one of those was like, an object in motion will stay in motion until it's acted upon by an outside force. So when your bullet strikes a window, for example, it's going to affect what it was doing. And especially with a lot of self-defense rounds that are designed to break apart and to change shape, as soon as it hits that window, it becomes a lot less predictable than it was beforehand. So if you're shooting something on the other side of a window, you have to account for that error. And often with things like glass, you might still be able to get away with shooting through it, knowing that I'm going to have to send probably 2 or 3 extra rounds before they become predictable. But that's assuming that you're not exposing anybody else to what those things might be doing once they cross the barrier, right? So if I shoot into a window and there's other people in the room other than the person I'm trying to shoot, they're potentially in danger by that, right? And the farther away they are from, like if they're, let's say, hypothetically, a guy comes up to a curtain and slides the curtain aside and looks outside and a sniper takes a shot, but he was like within a few inches of the glass, a lot safer, a lot more predictable. If you're shooting through glass and someone is deep in the room, you really have no idea what that bullet's going to do. It's really hard to predict. There are choices that you can make as it relates to things like caliber and the type of round that you're shooting that might make things a little bit better for you.
30 millimeter.
You can also do things like mitigate like angles that you're shooting into the glass and stuff like that. But the big ones are distance from the barrier of your target, which guess what? Still requires you to be able to see your target. Yeah. So there's that. And also what's around your target, right? If there's other people.
Yeah. Know your target and what's behind it. Fundamental rule of gun safety.
I heard that somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of barriers, if only there was some tool or equipment that police could employ that would give them cover and concealment while being able to close with and hold a subject at risk. Perhaps we could have special teams of highly proficient, specially equipped officers who specialize in making entry. If only.
So we should roll tanks into this neighborhood? Is that what I'm hearing, Jim?
Yeah, so this is a recurring theme, right? Is the militarization of police. A lot of the big, scary SWAT stuff is fundamentally defensive stuff. And this is a thing we really need to get better at communicating, right? The Bearcat, the armored vehicle, or even just the shield, those are things that often patrol doesn't have, is my understanding. And that's also one of the things that you can hide behind that gives you time, distance, and shielding that keeps you from having to cap everybody in an apartment.
Yep.
Okay. So consider that this was an area where SWAT might have been able to reduce the risk just because of the equipment they've got, right?
Yeah. So I want to hit on a thing that we touched on earlier, just as a takeaway towards the end here that we need to hit. And that is that in this particular incident, most of the officers were not wearing body-worn cameras. Now, admittedly, across the country, a lot of agencies were just coming online with this because although they've been around for a lot longer than 2020, there are some like logistical things that have to be worked out. Like, how do you store stuff? Where are you going to transfer stuff? What are how do I start and end my shift and get my camera first? And just a lot of things that like have taken time to get people used to body-worn cameras. But in 2020, we were well outside of the realm of like having excuses, particularly if you were going to go do a pre-planned execution of something like this, right? It's 2020 at the time when this happened. There's really like no good reason some of this shouldn't have been on camera in some form. And hell, that could have been a cell phone camera propped up like at the car or something if it boiled down to that. But I just want people to consider how much easier this would have been if some of this was captured on camera. And if the cops did a good job of knocking and announcing and identifying themselves as the police, then a lot of this conversation might not even happen. So there's that. Yep. But it's just, it makes everyone's job easier if it's on camera. And I remember there was a time when I was new to cameras and they were just kind of coming around my world. And there were some old school dog handlers that worked in my unit that were very wary of them. And their argument was, you never make a dog bite look good to a jury. They're always ugly, right? Like, you make grown men cry, it doesn't look good to a jury, right? That's just always going to not look good on us. And I will tell you, I would not do this job in this era without one in a million years. And now that I've experienced it, because if you look back at all the dog bites that I've had since I've gotten the camera, it's like, hey, that dude had every opportunity to give up, man. And he still ran. And and because the warnings were clear, he got several warnings, right? And then the dog went and did his thing. And it's like, yeah, he cried. He got messed up a little bit by the dog, but like, that was on him, right? So again, how much easier would this have been if something was captured on camera? And separate but kind of related to the cameras thing is the allegations that some of the facts were misrepresented to the judge. Again, going back to evidence, if I'm building a case and obtaining a search warrant or whatever, I want a case and evidence that is irrefutable. Cameras have a lot of limitations. There's a lot of things that cameras can see and can't see that humans can or can't see, right? It's supplemental. Despite their limitations, they always help. And if I have evidence that is irrefutable, if I have just data points, right? It doesn't have to tell the whole story. It's supplementary, right? It could still complement your case one way or the other. So get the damn cameras. No excuse.
Yeah. Big fan of cameras.
Yeah.
Speaking of cameras, we reached out to our buddies about this case and asked them, hey, Brain Trust, what do you think about this case? What should we have, we, the law enforcement world, tactical world, should have gotten right about it? And one of the recurring themes is the media narrative, that the agency messed up in the initial response and media narrative and let the media kind of run wild with misleading allegations and stuff. Is that a tactical concern, right? Mike already said we don't want to get into the non-tactical stuff, but I would offer that the information domain is part of your operational reality and you do have to influence it, right? So this is a little tough. The local media narrative had already formed because of previous frustrating interactions between law enforcement and African-American members of the community. Specifically, there was a case where a football player got pulled over in a saturation patrol and searched, and the community thought that was unreasonable. So they were already kind of frustrated over that. In addition to, decades of perceived wrongs, right? But what would have been a positive media narrative? What could a competent agency do with this? To try to explain to the community what went right, what went wrong, and what they're doing about it. Well, we'll get into that, but let me tell you what they said. And it took me a long time to find out what this agency actually said. Their release, as far as I could find, said, Louisville Metro Police Department officers were conducting a narcotics investigation at approximately 12:40 a.m. this morning near 24th and Elliott Streets. During the execution of a search warrant, gunfire was exchanged between officers and occupants of the residence. As a result of the gunfire, one female was fatally wounded by zombies.
I was waiting for it.
So, passive voice, fuzzy language, not super helpful.
And no responsibility conveyed.
No responsibility. And I understand there's an active investigation. We got to wait for the facts. Yeah, yes, true. Get the damn facts and put them out would be my offer. And so,
other people are going to do it for you if you're not quick about it.
Yeah, nature hates a vacuum. So let's give the agency all the benefit of the doubt. So 3 months later, let me tell you what the agency released. Incident Investigation Report, case number 80-20-TAC-017-049er. Public narrative. PIU investigation. Full stop. That's what they released. 2 words. PIU investigation. Good job, guys. So, again, nature hates a vacuum. The media ran with this. I think what they could have said was, we were conducting a drug investigation. We were concerned with packages going through this apartment. We were arresting the main purveyor of those packages across town. We're using the SWAT team to do that. and we wanted to find the packages and find cash related to them. So we went to this house. When we made entry into the house, an occupant shot at us and we shot right back. And in the crossfire, as far as we can tell at this point, unrelated, unarmed female occupant was struck in the crossfire and died. And we think that was a bad outcome, and we're going to investigate the hell out of it, and we're going to get to the right answer. Maybe something like that. Yep. And that probably eventually did come out over the months and years. The $12 million court case and the federal charges and the conspiracy charge against the detectives that one pled out to. I'm sure that probably came out, but man, wouldn't it have been nice to sort that out in the beginning with maybe some body worn cameras, some basic risk mitigation, asking the question, do we even need to do this? Can we do this during the day? Just a sanity check. Do we have the right house? Do we have the right people? You control the pace and the initiative in an offensive act. If you're going to go hit a house, that's an offensive act, right? You can choose to execute tomorrow. You can choose to execute while the subject is on the move out in town. If you put yourself into fair fights, you're going to get 50-50 bad outcomes. That's not good tactics. And, we can argue about giving police the benefit of the doubt and I wasn't there. That's fine. I wasn't there and I'm not a cop. What I am is a guy who studies tactics my entire adult life and has a professional degree in it. And I can tell you this was screwy tactics. And I think we can all say that and learn from it. Mike, what you got?
I want to go back to, I think Jim covers the risk management and the tactics side of it. We've been talking all episode about alternatives. And there's two big things that stand out to me about this, right? And that is, the first is we're supposed to be better than this, right? There's no, you can be frustrated that like we catch flack for things or that everyone thinks we're racist and, that the media has overblown things or narratives get out of control. Like there's all kinds of things that you can be frustrated or annoyed by. But at the end of the day, you still have to look objectively at something like this and be like, yeah, but we still fucked that up. And I say we, like I would like to think that I would never do anything like this, but I'm sure there's a window in my career where I did not have the knowledge or expertise. And I'm grateful that I had the oversight and the influence of the people who coached and mentored me along the way, and got me to the place where I was that prevented a worse outcome. But it's why, like, I think the show is important. It's why I'm grateful for the people that listen to this show, because hopefully they're thinking about this sort of thing. And so that's the big one, is that like we have to be better than this. And if you're frustrated by all those other things that I listed, like media narratives or, people calling you racist or cops catching flack or whatever, it's like, well, until we fix our own side of the street, like we can't complain about that too much.
Would you say maybe we are telling ourselves some lies about how good we are as the good guys?
Yeah, a little bit.
And would you say that, I would say, if the community isn't sure whether you're the good guys or the bad guys, maybe you need to think about that. And I don't want to be too preachy about it, but like, ooh, this is a nasty one. This is nastier than I think a lot of people wanted to admit.
Yeah.
All right.
And so there's that. And then where that takes me is also to like the training stuff. And a big part of the training thing, and this is something that we have to do a good job of marketing for ourselves, because I think a lot of cops understand this, but we don't explain it well. So not only do cops need to understand it better, but we need to sell it to the people who fund and resource and support us so that we can get adequate training. Because what we need to understand is that dealing with something like this is largely an emotional thing in so many ways, right? The investigation itself, I'm sure that at some point in this investigation, these guys thought they had the right people, they were doing the right thing, they were on to a good case. Like, it's completely plausible to me that there was no intentional wrongdoing as it relates to this whole thing. But the emotional side of this is, yeah, but now we want to get them. We want to win. We gotta close this case out. We want the big bust, right? Like, that's an emotional thing. And the emotional side of that is like, hey, it's not about you, dude. It's not about you and the credit and the bust, right? It's about the public and what are we here to serve. It's not about you making some arrest. So like, that's emotional. The response to gunfire and getting shot at is emotional. And a lot of the decisions to use force is emotional. And the way that we deal with that is through training and repetition. And we've really got to like fight for some of that, right? To get outside of our own little wheelhouse and to see the bigger picture. Because otherwise, like, we tell more of those lies to ourselves. And that sets us up for failure. And we get lucky most of the time. But then something like this happens. And it screws it up for the rest of us. Do better. That's all I got.
Be safe out there. Be smart out there. We're not going to live long enough to make all these mistakes ourselves. Let's learn from them. And we can do that without being jerks also to that agency and to the members of that agency who were presumably trying to do the best they could with what they had. Have a good night.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.